There's a type of person who walks into a room and immediately notices the wobbly table leg, who hears a strange noise in someone's car from 3 feet away, who can't sit through dinner when they know there's a problem in the kitchen that hasn't been addressed. And the most interesting thing about this person, they don't find it stressful, they find it thrilling. But here's what nobody talks about. This isn't just a personality quirk. This is a deep psychological pattern, one that's rooted in childhood, shaped by neuroscience, and connected to some of the most profound human needs we have. Today, we're going all the way in. We are going to unpack the full psychology of people who love to fix things, where it comes from, what it does to their relationships, where it becomes dangerous, and what it says about the extraordinary human capacity for hope. Let's go. Think about the fixers in your life. Maybe it's your dad, who spent every weekend under a car or rewiring something in the garage. Maybe it's a friend who can't hear about your problem for 30 seconds before they're already offering 3 solutions. Maybe it's a colleague who sees every broken system as a personal invitation. Or maybe, and I want you to sit with this, it's you. There's a reason some people are drawn to problems the way moths are drawn to light. It's not random. It's not just how they are. There is a rich, layered psychological story behind every person who feels genuinely compelled to restore what's broken, solve what's stuck, and repair what's fallen apart. And that story touches on childhood development, brain chemistry, identity formation, emotional regulation, and some of our deepest fears about control and meaning. What we're going to do today is walk through that story, layer by layer. We'll look at what neuroscience says about why fixing feels so good. We'll look at where this drive usually originates. We'll explore how it shapes relationships, for better and for worse. We'll talk about when the gift of fixing quietly turns into a trap. And we'll end somewhere that I think will genuinely reframe how you see yourself or the fixers in your world. This is a long one. It's worth it. Stay with me. Let's start with the brain, because this is where everything begins. When researchers study problem-solving behavior, they find something remarkable. The act of identifying and resolving a problem activates the brain's reward circuitry, specifically the release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. This is the same region that lights up when you eat something delicious, fall in love, or win a competition. In other words, for some people, fixing a broken thing is not just satisfying in a vague general sense. It is neurologically rewarding in the same category as some of the most pleasurable human experiences. But here's where it gets more specific. Not everyone experiences this equally. Research suggests that people who are naturally high in a trait called need for cognitive closure, a preference for clear, resolved, ordered states, tend to feel problem detection more acutely and problem resolution more intensely. For these individuals, an unresolved problem doesn't just sit quietly in the background. It creates a kind of low-grade psychological tension, almost like a hum that won't stop, until the thing is fixed. This is why the fixer at your dinner table can't enjoy the conversation. It's not that they don't care about you. It's that their nervous system is broadcasting the leaky faucet in the background like a fire alarm that only they can hear. There's also something called effectance motivation, a concept developed by psychologist Robert White in the 1950s. White argued that human beings have a fundamental, built-in drive to affect their environment, to interact with the world and make things happen. This isn't about survival. It's not about food or sex or safety. It's a drive for competence, for the experience of being effective. Fixers feel this drive at an unusually high intensity. When they solve a problem, they don't just feel pleased. They feel alive, because they have expressed one of the most basic human needs, the need to act and to matter. And this is where it gets profound. In a world that often feels chaotic, uncertain, and beyond our control, where global events are overwhelming, where relationships are unpredictable, where careers shift without warning, fixing something is one of the purest forms of agency available to us. You take something broken. You apply your knowledge, your hands, your mind, and you restore it, cause and effect, working perfectly, in real time. For someone whose brain is wired this way, that experience isn't just practical. It is psychological oxygen. Now let's go back, because for most fixers, this drive didn't just emerge from nowhere. It was cultivated. Often, it was necessary. Attachment research, particularly the work of John Bowlby and later Mary Ainsworth, tells us that children are exquisitely sensitive to instability in their environment. When a child grows up in a home where something is chronically wrong, financial stress, emotional volatility, parental conflict, illness, addiction, unpredictability, they develop adaptive strategies to survive it. One of the most common strategies is this: become useful, become competent, become the person who makes things better. A child who learns that if I manage this situation, the tension in the house goes down is learning something powerful, that their actions can change emotional reality, that they have a kind of power. And for a child who otherwise feels helpless, that power is enormously valuable. The psychologist Virginia Satir called this the family hero or family caretaker role. This is the child who mediates parental arguments, who takes care of younger siblings without being asked, who monitors the emotional temperature of every room they enter. They become hyper-attuned to problems, because problems were dangerous, and staying ahead of them was how you stayed safe. Fast forward 20, 30, 40 years. That child is now an adult. The house they grew up in is long behind them. But the neural pathways that were built by years of vigilance, caretaking, and problem-solving are still fully active, and they are now applied to everything. The colleague who can't stop optimizing broken workflows. The partner who turns every conversation about feelings into a troubleshooting session. The friend who volunteers to fix things for people who didn't ask them to. These aren't random behaviors. They are the echoes of a child who learned that the world was safer when they stayed useful and alert. Now, and this is important, not every fixer had a difficult childhood. Some simply grew up in environments where fixing was celebrated. A parent who was a craftsperson, an engineer, a doctor, a builder. A culture that valued competence and problem-solving as the highest form of contribution. For these people, the drive to fix isn't a wound, it's an inheritance. An identity passed down through admiration and example. But whether it grew from adversity or from inspiration, the psychological root is the same. At some point, fixing became part of who they are. Not just what they do. Not just a skill. An identity. And that distinction between behavior and identity is where the most interesting and most challenging dynamics begin. Ask most fixers what they're proud of, and they'll tell you about something they solved, a crisis they navigated, a project they rescued, a person they helped turn their life around. Very rarely will they say, "I'm proud of who I am," when I'm doing nothing at all. This is because many fixers have built their sense of self-worth on what psychologists call conditional positive regard, a concept introduced by Carl Rogers. Rather than having a stable sense of intrinsic value, I am worthy simply because I exist, they have built their value on performance. I am worthy because I am useful. I am good because I solve things. I matter because I help. On the surface, this looks like humility or diligence. Underneath, it is a fragile foundation. When fixers are effective, when the problem gets solved, the system gets repaired, the person gets helped, they feel an intense sense of rightness, of being exactly who they're supposed to be. But when they can't fix something, when a problem is beyond their reach, when a person doesn't get better despite their effort, when a situation remains broken no matter what they do, the response isn't just frustration. It is often something much deeper, a quiet but devastating sense of worthlessness. If I can't fix this, what am I good for? That thought, spoken or unspoken, lives in many fixers. And it explains a behavior pattern that can confuse the people around them, the inability to stop, to let a problem be, to accept that some things are not theirs to fix. The fixer who keeps pushing long after it's reasonable isn't being stubborn for no reason. They are fighting for their sense of self. Understanding this reframes everything. When someone insists on helping you even after you've said you're fine, when they won't let a conversation end without offering a solution, they're not trying to control you. They are trying to stay real to themselves. They are trying to keep feeling like they exist in a meaningful way. That is not a character flaw. It is a deeply human need, attached to a coping pattern that once served them and may now be holding them back. In relationships, fixers are extraordinary partners, up to a point. They show up. They notice when something is off. They work hard. They're reliable in a crisis. When something breaks, practically, emotionally, logistically, they don't panic. They move. They are the people you want in your corner when everything goes wrong. But relationships are not just problems to be solved. They are spaces to be inhabited. And fixers often struggle with the inhabiting. When their partner comes home exhausted and says, "I had the worst day," the fixer's instinct is to immediately ask what happened. "What can I do?" "Have you tried?" They mean well. Profoundly so. But what their partner needed wasn't a solution. They needed someone to sit beside them and say, "I know. That sounds really hard. I'm here." Psychologists call this the difference between fixing and witnessing. Fixing says, "I will help you get out of this." Witnessing says, "I will be with you in this." Both are forms of love, but they are not interchangeable, and fixers default so heavily toward fixing that their partners can begin to feel like projects rather than people. Over time, this creates a painful dynamic. The partner or friend starts to filter what they share, knowing that every vulnerability will become a problem to be solved. They stop talking about how they feel, because talking leads to advice, not connection. They pull away, quietly, to protect the intimacy that the fixing keeps accidentally dismantling. The fixer, sensing the distance, works harder, offers more solutions, does more, helps more, and the gap widens. There is also the question of unsolicited intervention. Fixers often step in before they are asked, rearranging things, making decisions, correcting courses. From their perspective, they are being proactive. From the other person's perspective, they are being told, implicitly, that they are not capable of managing their own life. Over time, relationships with fixers can begin to feel quietly diminishing, not because the fixer intended any harm, but because constant fixing sends a message: "You are a problem, and I am the solution." The fixer never means it that way. They mean, "I love you, and I want to remove everything that causes you pain." That impulse is beautiful. But love, in its fullest form, also allows people the dignity of their own struggles. The healthiest fixers eventually learn what might be the hardest skill of their lives: how to ask before acting. How to say, "Do you want me to help, or do you just want me to listen?" That one question transforms relationships. It tells the other person, "I see you as a person, not a problem." And that is where real intimacy lives. For some fixers, the drive goes beyond helpfulness into something psychologists call the savior complex. A pattern where a person feels not just willing, but responsible for rescuing others from pain, failure, or poor choices. This pattern tends to emerge from the same roots we discussed earlier, a childhood where managing others' emotions felt necessary, where being helpful was how you stayed loved, where the cost of not fixing something felt too high. The savior pattern fixer doesn't just help when asked. They seek out people and situations that need saving. They are drawn to partners who struggle, friends who are in crisis, jobs where everything is on fire. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because dysfunction is where they feel most at home, most needed, most real. And the cost is enormous. When you feel responsible for everyone, you are never fully off duty. There is always someone who needs more. Always a situation that isn't resolved yet. Always another fire. The fixer in this mode is never resting. They are only pausing before the next emergency. This leads to one of the quietest and least discussed forms of burnout: the exhaustion that comes not from overwork, but from over-responsibility. From carrying, emotionally, the weight of problems that were never yours to carry. The way out is not to stop caring. It is to practice, slowly, imperfectly, with great difficulty, the art of allowing. Allowing people to face their own consequences. Allowing situations to unfold without intervention. Allowing yourself to be a witness, not a rescuer. Allowing the world, sometimes, to be broken without making it your emergency. That is not indifference. That is one of the most advanced forms of emotional maturity a fixer can develop. I want to make sure we end here with something that is absolutely true. The fixer's psychology, at its core, is a psychology of hope. At the bottom of everything, beneath the dopamine, the childhood adaptation, the identity construction, the relational complexity, there is a belief. A stubborn, defiant, beautiful belief that things can be better. That broken does not mean permanent. That effort is meaningful. That the world responds to care and attention and skill. In a culture increasingly defined by passivity, by scrolling, by reacting, by complaining, fixers are the people who do something. They are the engineers who rebuild infrastructure after disasters, the therapists who sit with broken people week after week, the parents who stay up at night trying to understand what their child needs, The friends who show up with tools when you say something is wrong. The world does not function without fixers. Communities do not recover without them. Relationships do not survive without at least one person willing to do the work of repair. The fixer's drive, channeled with self-awareness and wisdom, is not a burden on the world. It is one of its most essential gifts. So here's where I want to leave you. If you are a fixer, if you recognized yourself anywhere in this video, I want you to hear this clearly. Your instinct to fix things is not a flaw. It is not something to be ashamed of or trained out of you. It is a form of love, a form of courage, a form of hope made practical. But the most powerful version of you is not the one who fixes everything for everyone all the time. It is the one who knows when to act, when to ask, when to listen, and, hardest of all, when to let something be. You deserve to be on your own repair list, not as a project, as a person. And if this video helped you see yourself, or someone you love, more clearly, then it did exactly what it was supposed to do. That's what this channel is here for. Every week, we go deep into the psychology of human behavior, not to judge it, but to understand it. Because understanding is where everything begins to change. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. The next video is already coming, and I think you're going to want to see it.